remains together on the front bench, which is I can't remember any other department in my time in politics, but it's a good thing to have continuity. It does limit our excuse to say we're just getting on top of our brief, though, however. Could just say to my honourable friend, look, that's why Afghanistan matters. Afghanistan matters because it is often the keystone or the linchpin in that part of the world, and what happens in Afghanistan can ripple throughout the region and further along, as we saw with Al-Qaeda, obviously, in 2001. It's really important. Myself and my honourable friend, the Minister of the Armed Forces, will be setting off to the region this week to discuss with a number of the neighbouring countries. Pakistan and China are significant countries in the international community that we have to engage with to make sure that Afghanistan doesn't go from bad to worse and that we reverse radicalisation where it appears.
Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is right. The biggest threat from Afghanistan is the country becoming once again the base for extremist terrorist groups. The biggest risk is that the British government gives this the same lack of attention and preparation they gave to Afghanistan in the 18 months ahead of the NATO withdrawal. So why on earth is the Prime Minister now cutting back by more than a half on his National Security Council meetings?
The Right Honourable Member makes the point, and he will be referring obviously to the report that he has already commented on previously. While the report by the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy makes a number of those points, some of which I disagree with, because as I've said previously at the dispatch box, the Prime Minister often chooses that in national security that departments can generate their concerns and come together with national security ministers to discuss the issues. It doesn't always have to be done in a formal NSC. It can be done in a sort of subcommittee where we get across sometimes even much smaller issues. But nevertheless, it also makes the point in that report that Afghanistan isn't mentioned much in the integrated review, but in the Defence Command paper he will notice that it's mentioned 9 times, Afghanistan. It's incredibly important. We didn't neglect it into the lead up to the fall of Afghanistan. In fact, we were investing more troops and more people in the last few weeks till we got to the point.
Laura Farris.
Number 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
The replacement warhead programme will allow the UK to maintain our independent, minimal credible nuclear deterrent for the foreseeable future. The UK's sovereign nuclear deterrent exists to deter the most extreme threats to our national security and will remain essential for as long as the global security situation demands it.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the privilege of representing the atomic weapons establishment in Aldermaston, which has been tasked with developing the new nuclear warhead. I, of course, welcome the announcement last week of the AUKUS security pact, but can my right honourable friend confirm that it won't undermine the strategic importance of the new warhead and that the AWE will remain at the forefront of our critical defence of this country?
Thank you. Look, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving me the opportunity to make something very clear about the agreement with Australia and the United States. This is not a programme about nuclear weapons. This is a programme about nuclear propulsion, to give the Australians the strategic capability that they have decided is the right capability to meet the threat. That aside, Aldermaston is an incredibly important part of the defence establishment and the amazing workforce that contribute and have done over the decades to ensuring that Britain has a nuclear deterrent that is credible. And I'm delighted to say that we continue to invest in those peoples, their livelihoods and the science base that is so important to ensure we have that capability.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Secretary talks about the workforce. The reality is that they've just outsourced the fire service to Capita at both Fastlane and Coolport, and Capita is now shamefully cutting jobs. They've cut 8 posts. The fire service have unanimously voted for industrial action. We've got a current overtime ban on. When is he going to get grip of this situation, end the outsourcing experiment and give the fire service the support they need to keep the bases safe?
Well, the honourable member has obviously missed the point that we've nationalised Aldermaston recently in completely the opposite direction.
Sir Robert Sims.
Number 6. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alongside DIT and SCDO, we are hugely supportive of defence export campaigns to our friends and allies, a posture reinforced by DCIS. I've conducted regular meetings on exports in Poland, Finland, Ukraine and Greece over the course of the summer. Tomorrow I'm engaged in meetings in Tokyo before joining potential international partners on Type 31 in Rosyth. Babcock having announced only last week a frigate deal with Indonesia.
Can I congratulate the defence team on all the work they're putting in to get more defence exports. Not only does this is good for British defence, but it's good for jobs. I have one concern, though. The licensing system seems to have slowed down, not only because of COVID, but because it's actually very bureaucratic. Could the Minister take up with the Department of International Trade, who deal with this, and have a word with them to try and speed this up? Because I fear some of my local companies are losing business.
I think there were 11,000 licences granted during the COVID period. But I note his concern. It's a real concern shared elsewhere in the House, I know. DIT attempt to say that 70% of cases will be dealt with within 20 days, 99% within 60 days. But as we set out in DCIS, we do need to get better, both in terms of transparency and speed, and we will be taking it up. I thank you for the question.
Martin Docker to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the gap between ally and systemic competitor narrows, we also heard last week that China is planning to join the Global Britain in the sunlit uplands of the CPTPP. Now, given all we've heard of the integrated review about the UK having a more joined-up foreign security and trade policy, I'd be interested to hear from the Minister's opinion on this strange news and what it's such a trade deal that the Chinese Communist Party finds so attractive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not actually in a great position to speak on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, but I can speak on behalf of the government. I am delighted by the fact that we have got a tilt to the Indo-Pacific, and that is coming through in so many different ways in the policy of this government. It's a part of the world that's going to have 40% of global GDP in the not-too-distant future. We need to be properly engaged, and that's what we're doing.
Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I welcome the new nuclear alliance with Australia and the United States? I wish we were a bit more robust about the language of saying why we're doing it. This is to stand up with China's errant behaviour in the South China Sea. Let's not continue to be in denial about that. But the timing and the manner of this announcement is not without diplomatic consequence and prompts further questions about the cohesion, purpose, indeed leadership of NATO after bruised departure from Afghanistan. There's no doubt France has overreacted to losing a major procurement deal, but would the Defence Minister recognise that China's authoritarian behaviour cannot be defeated by military means alone? You need all the tools and all the alliances working towards a common strategic aim, and if we don't resolve a sense of unity in the West and indeed NATO,
Order. The chair of the Select Committee should know better. You can't make a speech. It's got to be a question. I've got you in deliberately because of the job you hold, but you can't take complete advantage of the chamber. It's not fair. Who wants to answer it?
All the questions were excellent, Mr. Speaker, and I'll try and come into them. On the, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry. What did you say? Do you want to withdraw? Right. Well, I'm in charge, and I'm not trying to abuse my position, so don't abuse yours. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, firstly, in relation to the agreement between the United States and Australia, to be absolutely clear, this is a requirement, an Australian requirement for their strategic purposes. It's a decision that they wanted to make in order to enhance their strategic capability and their strategic defence. And we have got very strong contacts and a relationship with Australia and the United States, quite transparently, and it'll be a pleasure to work with them and help deliver this important strategic capacity for Australia. In terms of France, again, we work very, very closely with the French. My right honourable friend is well aware that with the Lancaster House Agreement, there are ongoing discussions about incredibly important joint defence initiatives that we run together. I was in contact with my opposite number over the weekend, and I am looking forward to us working very closely with the French in the years ahead, as we've always done in the past.
Dave Do.
Mr. Speaker, with Babcock's Arrowhead 140 frigate having been selected by Indonesia and an outstanding endorsement of Scottish engineering, will the Minister ensure that all available effort is expended by Government to assist in future foreign orders, both for licensed build in country and also for foreign governments to have their ships built in Scotland?
Mr. Speaker, I mentioned in my substantive answer, I totally agree with the honourable gentleman. I've been working in Poland, in Ukraine, in many other parts of the world, in Greece, and many other parts of the world where Babcock has aspirations. The United Kingdom government has got a great belief in the Scottish Yards, far more belief than the Scottish government appears to have, given some of their recent contracts.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I too welcome the AUKUS deal, which gives great form to global Britain and could be very good for jobs in both Barrow and Derby. Could we remind the Australians when they begin their 18-month assessment The astute UK submarine is arguably even more capable than the US Virginia class, and by the way, it's cheaper.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is a great advocate for British engineering and British defence jobs. There is an awful lot which is good about our astute programme, but I'm not going to second-guess the Australian 18-month assessment. They will work that through, but both we and the United States are there to support them in delivering this extremely important strategic capability.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Malcolm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see you back from Coronation Street in such fine form and to see the defence team still in its place. Mr. Speaker, when the integrated review was presented to the House by the government, we were told that this Indo-Pacific tilt would not undermine interests in the Euro-Atlantic area. So can the Minister tell the House exactly how engaging in secret diplomacy against the mutual security and against the trust interests with one of our closest European allies helps our interests in the Euro-Atlantic area?
Mr. Speaker, I think that would be an accidental understanding of the situation from the honourable gentleman. The reality is a close friend and a close ally decided they had a different strategic need. They wanted to do something differently. They approached us, and it would have been very strange not to have engaged in very constructive talks with Australia in those circumstances. That's not being secret or going behind people's backs. That's responding to a request.
Yeah. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Was, Mr. Speaker, let's not muddy the words here. Paris was deceived, was it not? And isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that common challenges are better faced when liberal democracies trust each other and we understand each other's mutual interests? Whether it's the rise of authoritarianism, issues with climate change, terrorism, or indeed migration, we must be aligned with Euro-Atlantic allies first. So hasn't the fallout from AUKUS taught us all that what we need to pursue is a comprehensive defence and security treaty with the European Union? Yep. And can he tell us then, why was France excluded right from the start?
Mr. Speaker, we have got a close relationship. We've got a number of close relationships, including through Five Eyes, which we pursue on a global basis. We have an extremely close relationship with France, with whom we are doing so much around the world and with whom we enjoy extremely close relationships on equipment and sport, but also actively in the field. The bedrock of our relationships inside Western Europe is, of course, NATO. It's something which the honourable gentleman would agree with. It is absolutely vital. That is the absolute cornerstone of our defence and an area where we work so closely with our European allies, including France.
Robert Hull.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Armed Forces are one of this country's biggest providers of apprenticeships. We have around 21,000 apprentices on programmes at any one time, ranging from engineering and digital to construction and driving, showing, Mr. Speaker, that if you join the Armed Forces, you get skills for life.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for all the work that the Ministry of Defence is doing on apprenticeships. Can I just confirm that he will continue, his department will continue to meet the target of 2.3% public sector target for hiring apprentices? And can I ask him also to ensure that any company that gets a procurement contract with the Ministry of Defence has a significant number of apprentices, employs a significant number of apprentices, otherwise they won't get the contract?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to confirm that. Over 90% of recruits are offered an apprenticeship, and I'm pleased to confirm that our recent statistics show that 7.9% of our headcount are new apprentice starts, exceeding a government public sector target of 2.3. But of course, we do have ongoing discussions with the DfE to increase this figure.
Chris Law.
Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer questions 8 and 16 together. I routinely engage at all levels, both nationally and internationally, in order to tackle the threat of terrorism across the Middle East, North Africa and the wider region. We continue to work with allies and regional partners to promote a safe and secure Afghanistan and to prevent the terrorist groups from gaining any foothold in the country in the future.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has MOD made in collaboration with the security and intelligence services of the impacts of the cuts to UK bilateral aid in Iraq and Afghanistan and on the increasing potential for international terrorism?
Well, I think what I can say to honourable members is that the reduction in CSS funding, which I suspect is what he's referring to, partly is because the CSS funding to continue would potentially go in the hands of the Taliban. And I think as the fall of Afghanistan was happening, I don't think that would be a wise thing to do for anyone. But secondly, he should also not rule out the fact that counter-terrorism funding, both for here and abroad, has increased significantly since 2015, well over 30% of funding, both for civilians, such as the police and the intelligence services, but also through special forces and indeed the armed forces as well. The direction of travel is increasing, not decreasing. The capability that we are procuring, such as the drones that we have recently signed up to, will give us extra capability that we didn't have all those years ago in 2001.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr Speaker, can the Secretary of State indicate when an update will be given to the House on the terror threat the UK faces following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and the attendant heightened potential for terrorism being harboured there?
The Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre sets, Mr Speaker, the threat levels for this country. They do that independent of government ministers, and when they are changed, they will make the statement and then the House will be informed. As far as a bulletin or an update to the House, a statement, the Honourable Lady is obviously free to table a motion either in the adjournment debate or indeed through written questions, and we'll be happy to make sure we do that. On top of that, we had the periodical updates in Afghanistan, as you will remember, in the counter-Daesh strategy. We will continue to make that from time to time.
Dr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given that long-term nation building from the ground up is not a feasible option in future, and given that terrorist attack could yet happen again, will he institute a serious review of counter-terrorism strategy, possibly based on pre-positioned forces in regional bases to follow an active containment strategy?
My right honourable friend highlights an important point, which is when there is no partnership on the ground, how do we deal with imminent threat to the United Kingdom? While I can't speak for the whole of government on a review of a CT strategy, first of all because I think contest in its many iterations, starting obviously in the last Labour government, is probably a world-leading counter-terrorism strategy. It is periodically refreshed, and always that will be done in time to meet the changing situation. What I can tell him is that before even the decline in Afghanistan, I had instigated work on how we can deal with changes to the environments that we fight terrorism in and what capabilities we will need to do so in the future.
Paul Maynard.
Thank you. Can the Defence Secretary give the House an update on the work of French and British forces in Mali and the wider Sahel region?
The United Kingdom supports the French forces Operation Barkhane in Mali with a squadron of Chinook heavy lift helicopters. At the same time, we are also deployed on the UN MINUSMA deployment, some 300 British forces on one of the most dangerous UN deployments, helping nation building and also peacekeeping. We also can talk on intelligence channels around the threats, and we are both concerned about the appearance of the Russian mercenary group Wagner, now appearing in many parts of West Africa.
Number 9.
Mr Speaker, since the 28th of August, 7,900 applications have been made to the ARAP scheme, of which 900 have appeared eligible under the MOD's perspective, but I would just say to the honourable gentleman that obviously thereafter there are Home Office checks that need to follow. 50 applicants have thus far completed their Home Office checks and will be in the process of being advised on how to proceed.
Minister, for that answer, but I have cases of people who work for the Supreme Court in Afghanistan, the government, and also for were members of the armed forces there, and clearly assisted in our operations in Afghanistan. Surely the Minister accepts that these people are at severe risk, and surely under Category 1 of ARAP they should qualify, yet they've been refused. So how many people who clearly qualify under the categories for ARAP are being turned down in the figures that he's just given me?
Well, Mr Speaker, I just gave the honourable gentleman the numbers for those that have applied since the 28th of August. I accept completely that there will be a matter of interpretation, but having looked at a number of cases where we've been invited to review them at ministerial level, I'm satisfied that actually the right judgments are being made. I know that's a disappointment to many members of the House who are working hard to support people who are in Afghanistan and who they consider to be at risk. but it's not possible for us to bring out everybody who's had a connection with the UK Armed Forces under the ARAP scheme. That's why the terms were set out as tightly as they were. And if the Honourable Gentleman would like me to look at any particular cases, I look forward to having that in writing, and I'll do what I can.
Minister Stephen Malcolm.
Mr Speaker, there is increasing confusion around the Government's administration of the ARAP scheme. In response to a written question, the Minister for the Armed Forces said that 1,194 locally employed staff have been relocated by the end of August. Yet, in a further answer, he suggested that only 850 applications have been processed in the same time frame. This means at least 344 people are unaccounted for. The Prime Minister says it's 311. Can the Minister therefore tell the House here and now how many applications were received between April and August, how many were accepted, and how many have been left behind?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'll write to the Honourable Gentleman with the exact detail he requests. 15,000 people were brought out in the airlift, as I think he knows. I think the numbers that he quotes and the discrepancy that he thinks he's found relates to the fact that 311 was the number of people who had been called forward, so they had successfully applied and been cleared by UKVI for travel, but we were unable to get them onto a plane. That is different from the number of people who had applications in process at the time and hadn't been called forward for travel. Mr Speaker, I'm sure that, in fact I know from all of my engagements with colleagues across the House, that they will understand that those 2.5 weeks in Kabul were somewhat hectic. It will take some time for the dust to settle on exactly who is out, who we have yet to bring out, but we are still working very hard to do so. Security situation is dynamic, our partnerships in the region are being developed, but we have every confidence that we'll be able to help those that need help.
Number 10, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The final contract for the manufacture of the fleet solid support ships will be awarded to a UK business either solely or as part of a consortium. We've been clear that a significant proportion of the build work will be carried out in the UK.
Gavan Jones.
Mr Speaker, in spring of this year, the Ministry of Defence invited international companies to collaborate with UK firms to build the FSS contract, and early this year they awarded a £5 million design contract for the project. Now, I've tried in numerous questions to the Minister to try and get the answers to these questions, and I've got to say to him his answers should be getting creative writing awards for their ways of avoiding answering questions. So can I ask him a direct question? Is, in terms of design contracts, who are the design contracts with? Are they with the consortium or the individual companies in the contract? And secondly, can he confirm that the prime contractor, the Windsor's contract, will be a UK company?
We are engaged with the consortiums as a whole. The finer points of where exactly the contract lies within that consortium I would have to check on for the Right Honourable Gentleman, but it is a consortium that is being appointed to conduct the design work. It is a consortium we expect to do that work. It is then the consortium that we'll be turning to for the next stage. And as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, there are four awards that have been made, and they are for £5 million each from memory, and they go to each of those consortium, all of which have got a UK component, which will then be presenting not only their design but their views onto the next stage, onto the build programme. But I'll come back on the precise point that the Right Honourable Gentleman makes. It's a fair question.
I think it's a bit rich from the party opposite to be nitpicking on this contract when the competition which they were calling for shipyards in the UK to be required to build the fleet solid support ship is precisely what the Minister has engineered. Could he just say and confirm to the House that following last week's outstanding exhibition at DSEI in Docklands, where, as he's already referred to, there were further contracts for British shipbuilders, for the announcement of the establishment of the National Shipbuilding Office and the AUKUS announcement, the opportunities for defence shipbuilding in this country have never been greater.
I thank my right honourable friend. I was so flattered to be awarded the Creative Writing Award by the right honourable gentleman. I was perhaps too kind. There is an awful lot which is great going on in British shipbuilding at the moment. He's been calling for the design contracts to be awarded. They've been awarded. We're getting on with FSS, and there is great news, as my right honourable gentleman says, regarding right honourable friend suggests regarding Type 31 as well. So a lot of good news in the sector.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Number 11, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, Mr Speaker, I would like to answer questions 11 and 19 together. Defence Medical Services provide a responsive and comprehensive treatment service for personnel requiring medical intervention. We have improved access to mental health care and given Armed Forces personnel greater choice with the introduction of new ways of working, including digital triage and remote video consulting.
Dame Diana.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Armed Forces Covenant, as the Minister knows, states that those injured in service, whether physically or mentally, should be cared for in a way that reflects the nation's moral obligations to them. But the government has actually missed targets on all mental health care for veterans across all services in England. And unless this changes, doesn't this risk rendering the Covenant, which I know the government wants to strengthen, meaningless? And actually, the government need to get their act together on mental health services for veterans and the armed forces.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the contrary, we are giving teeth to the Armed Forces Covenant by passing the Armed Forces Bill, and we will ensure that no veteran, in whatever circumstances, is ever disadvantaged.
Gerald Jones.
Mr Speaker, charities across the UK, including many who have supported veterans, have been hit hard, as we know, during the pandemic, impacting on the services that they could provide. So could I ask the Minister, what additional support is the government offering charities to be able to cope with demand, and what more can the government itself do to support veterans, given that their record so far is pretty poor?
Well, on the contrary, Mr Speaker, we're putting an additional £3 million into Up Courage, making that more than £20 million this year, and an additional £5 million into Armed Forces Charity, which means that more than £25 million will go to Armed Forces charities this year. Mr Speaker, I think that shows that the government is putting its money where its mouth is.
Bob Seeley.
13, please, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last week was a good week for defence jobs. I announced investments in laser and radio frequency weapons, which will sustain...
You're grouping.
I do apologise, Mr Speaker. I omitted to say, may I take this question with question number 15 and question number 20 with your permission, sir? Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And now, if I may respond to the question. Last week was a very good week for defence jobs. I announced investments in laser and radio frequency weapons, which will sustain 249 jobs and create 49 more, including 30 in Northern Ireland, and investment to enhance the capabilities of C-17 and Chinook, supporting 200 UK jobs and creating 50 at RAF Bryce Norton. And on Friday, my right honourable friend announced a £170 million investment in next-generation submarines, supporting 250 jobs at Barrow and 100 jobs at Rolls-Royce Derby. The UK sector more broadly already directly and indirectly supports over 200,000 jobs across the UK.
Bob Seeley.
Speaker, firstly, I'd like to add my thanks to all the service personnel who are not pitting and pay tribute to the as ever impressive leadership of Brigadier James Martin. Radar is vital to our nation's defence. Royal Navy's radar is made in Cowes on the Isle of Wight. Does the government have a plan for the development of next generation radar?
It absolutely does, Mr Speaker. The honourable gentleman is an assiduous proponent of the island's defence sector. I visited GKN Aerospace in Cowes in the summer, one of a number of great companies on the island. And on radar, he will be pleased to hear that we are indeed working closely with BAE Systems on potential spiral development of the current maritime radar.
Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituency of West Bromwich East boasts great skills and is only 30 minutes away from Telford's production hub of the British Army's Boxer fighting vehicle. What is the Minister going to do to ensure UK SMEs get proper access to contracts in defence supply chains, including our fantastic businesses in the Black Country?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. MOD equipment and support spend with SMEs exceeded 21% last year. We are determined to push this higher, and I'll be publishing a revised SME action plan later this year. On Boxer, which the honourable lady referred to, over 60% of the contract is expected to benefit UK suppliers. Following the IR, we are considering expanding the purchase, which will create even more opportunities for SMEs, including in the Black Country.
Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Lincolnshire is rightly proud of its RAF links. The Future Combat Air project will support jobs and bring crucial capability. Can my honourable friend confirm that this is on track with both our international partners and our industries?
Mr Speaker, it is absolutely on track. You'll be pleased to hear further progress was made last week with our international partners, Italy and Sweden, with both of whom I've been in discussion over the summer. It's on my agenda for my meeting tomorrow with the Defence Secretary in Japan. On our £2 billion investment in FCAS is benefiting from the co-investment of hundreds of millions of pounds from our industrial partners.
John Speller.
But of course, jobs in the industry actually depend on contracts. So can I come back to the question posed very directly to the Minister, which he's tried to slide by, about the Fleet Solid support ships? Why doesn't he give that clear message to industry and to the workforce that actually they will prioritise British jobs and that clearly the design contracts will go to a British firm? Why doesn't he actually make a proper decision and actually send that message, and also to the steel industry as well?
I'm hoping to send a very exact message, and I can reassure the right honourable gentleman that, as I've said, that we've made it absolutely clear that that contract will go to a British company solely or part of a consortium, and social value, which we have introduced, will be, and its variance thesis, will be a very significant part of that overall assessment phase. And I look forward to the ongoing bit of this competition. He's pushed for it for a very long time. It's ongoing. It is going to happen, and there will be, I'm certain, British companies absolutely embedded throughout that process.
Yeah. Shadow Minister Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know the defence industry has been subject to a spate of takeovers. Many familiar names like Cobham and GKN Aerospace are now in foreign hands, while Meggitt has been subject to a recent US-based takeover bid. Even though the companies have promised to protect jobs and research and development, it has not stopped them selling assets and closing factories. Workers at GKN Driveline in Erdington, Birmingham are going on strike to protest that there will be 500 redundancies next May. What is the government doing to ensure when British companies are taken over, promises to keep jobs and research and development in this country are kept?
As the Speaker, as you'll be aware, the legislation we've passed broadening the scope in which intervention can take place was cleared through this Parliament and is ready to be introduced. We take very seriously our responsibilities under the Enterprise Act. It's a matter for the Secretary of State at Bayes acting in his particular capacity, but there are guarantees that can be sought and can be enforced as part of that process.
Trevor Lee.
Number 14, sir.
Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Defence conducts a range of operations domestically and overseas, both independently and jointly with allies, including with the United States. We keep our operations and our broader military posture under continuous active review.
Edward.
Now, following the debacle in Afghanistan, we know that we can't rely on America. Will the Secretary of State make clear his commitment to our closest ally and traditional ally, namely France, which is absolutely vital for our interests, particularly in regard to migration and many other issues? Will he commit himself to working with the French to improve relations and perhaps involve them in this new relationship in the Pacific?
Mr. Speaker, I listened to my right honourable friend and his points. First of all, the United States and France are our closest allies. The United States is the cornerstone of NATO, by far outspending and out-contributing to than any other European nation on that security. It has been the guarantor of European security for decades, and we should not forget that. When it comes towards France, I have an extremely close relationship with my French counterpart. I have met her only a month or two ago. I had dinner with her in Paris. Even months before that, we speak regularly. Britain and France on many issues are joined at the hip: complex weapons, counter-terrorism, Africa, both West and East Africa issues, and indeed more recently, obviously, in places like Iraq and Syria. There is absolutely no intent here by the United Kingdom government to slight, upset or drive a wedge between us and France. It may be that members would like to listen to the media, but the fundamentals are we have more in common than we have differing. Us. There was no sneakiness behind the back. It was fundamentally Australia's right to choose a different capability, and it did. Mr. Speaker, despite NATO's withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Middle East and wider region remains a major source of threat to the UK. We will continue to engage and invest to keep us all safe. We remain in NATO's training mission in Iraq and fly missions under Operation Shader. Most recently, planes from the RAF conducted a strike against Daesh on the 6th of September. Syria remains a cause of concern, with 900,000 civilians still trapped in Idlib province. It is now the government's view that Turkey's presence is providing stability and averting a catastrophic humanitarian crisis there. That is something the UN representatives have also made clear to me when I visited some months ago. We continue to work to update our defence intelligence assessments and work across government identifying options to support our NATO ally, Turkey.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you're as pleased as I am with the Operation Warm Welcome. So I'd like to ask the Secretary of State, what warm welcome are we giving to those members of the Afghan Armed Forces and intelligence officers who've come to the UK from Afghanistan through Operation Pitting, many of whom have trained in our military establishments such as Sandhurst and the Royal College of Defence Studies, which I was present at last year. And what steps is the my right honourable friend taking to identify them and integrate them, perhaps into our own armed forces?
Well, first of all, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question. My colleague, the Minister for Defence, Personnel and Veterans, is absolutely leading the charge here to ensure that, first of all, those people who, some of whom are arriving to a strange and obviously very confusing outlook from where they have literally taken off one uniform, got on a plane and arrived in the United Kingdom. And we felt it was incredibly important in defence that the veterans community, the local government, Home Office, etc., reach out a hand of friendship and support them as they integrate into society. We are doing that. We are looking at people who have already qualified, such as going through Sandhurst into the armed forces, to see what use we can do. But all the way through, we shall mentor them and put our arm around them.
Yeah. We now come to Shadow Secretary of State John Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask the Defence Secretary about the Ajax armoured vehicle, the biggest defence procurement failure since the Nimrod. What did the Defence Secretary know about the Ajax flaws when he published the integrated review in his Defence White Paper in March, scrapping Warrior, scaling back Challenger and fully backing Ajax?
I knew there was a troubled programme which I have never resiled from at all in this House. In fact, since, as the honourable member will know, right honourable member will know, since taking over this job, we have been absolutely determined to open up this programme, get to the bottom of its failings, and shortly we will come to the House with more detail on that programme. I felt that this programme, going right back to March 2010, has been a troubled programme that needs to be fixed. Can it be fixed? That is what we are working to make sure we do, but it is nothing to do with linking Warrior and the others, which I know the Right Honourable Member is trying to make the case for.
Really?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this isn't just another troubled programme or another piece of army kit. His Defence White Paper confirms Ajax is fundamental to the future of British ground forces. Now, when our NATO allies in Europe already see a Prime Minister with the hots for his Indo-Pacific tilt, now Ajax, alongside the AUKUS nuclear propulsion pact, raised serious concerns over Britain's sustained contribution and commitment to NATO. What's the Secretary of State doing to settle those concerns?
Well, first of all, what the Right Honourable Member has missed off is I also committed and brought forward the buying of Boxer, a German, British, Dutch project that will obviously be made in Telford, providing jobs. I also brought forward the Challenger 3 upgrade with BAE Rheinmetall, a German company partnering with a British company to provide jobs. There's a strong, solid, metallic commitment to Europe, and at the same time we press forward with FCAS with Italy and Sweden.
My constituents hold the armed services in the highest regard, so there was some serious dismay when the Army Reserve Centre in Chipping Barnet appeared on a list of sites for potential housing development in the emerging local plan. Will the Minister or the Secretary of State give the strongest assurances that the TA Centre will stay in operational use for the foreseeable future?
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to be able to confirm to my right honourable friend that the High Barnet Army Reserve Centre has a continuing defence use, and there are currently no plans for its sale.
Kirsty Nelson.
Mr. Speaker, academics at the London School of Economics have concluded that this government's plan to lift the current cap on Trident nuclear weapons based on the Clyde from 180 to 260 are inconsistent with the UK government's obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Specifically, the 40% increase constitutes a breach of Article 6 of the treaty. So can I ask the Secretary of State, is international law of no concern to this government?
No, I think I would just say that I have it on better authority than those academics that we haven't.
Use the combination of our EU exit, the Enterprise Act and the new social value rules from HM Treasury to ensure that more British ships are built and with more British content?
Yes, I think it's really important that we seek to build more British ships, but we should also recognise there is an international collaboration to shipbuilding. When I signed with the Indonesian Defence Minister recently the deal to buy the design of the Arrowhead Type 31, we should also reflect that that design originated in Denmark. But the intellectual property was shared with us so that we now profit from that sale and British jobs will sail. International collaboration is important, unlocking investment, which is why we're now going to indicate the longest shipping pipeline for many decades so that British companies can invest knowing that there are ships in the pipeline.
Alan Brown.
Mr. Speaker, earlier on I raised the serious concerns of the fire service crews that are based at Fastlane and Coolport following outsourcing to Capita who have cut jobs. The Secretary dismissed my concerns out of hand, saying the service nationalised. Will he confirm, does he know, is Capita running the service or not? And if he doesn't know, he needs to get a grip of this.
The honourable member should actually listen to the answer. He was making a point about privatisation, and I was making the point that Aldermoston had just been nationalised by the government, which was the opposite ideological scene that he was trying to infer.
Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a veteran, I know of the hard work, dedication and often sacrifice our great armed forces make. There are many of these families in Wolverhampton that live and support what the great armed forces do. Will the Minister do everything he can to make sure all serving and former service personnel have all the support they and their families need moving forward?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I agree entirely with my honourable friend. Service families at the heart of the defence community. Our assistance to them includes wraparound childcare, which has currently been piloted, and support to partner employment. We will shortly bring forward the Armed Forces Family Strategy, which will deliver choice and flexibility to service families, because you must be able to serve your country, Mr. Speaker, while also supporting your family.
Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can ministers tell us what discussions they've had with the Home Office regarding the Commonwealth visa issue for former serving personnel? It's something that's entirely missing from the integrated strategy review, and I'd like to know when this House will get an update.
We obviously published a consultation on a number of proposals for the visa system around Commonwealth soldiers. We will be publishing a response very, very soon, and he'll get the answers he requires.
Gentleman Presley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend has already referred to the great economic benefits resulting from the £400 million investment in enhancing our C-17 and Chinook capability. But does he also agree that it will help us to ensure that we can continue to undertake complex operations like the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan, where C-17 transport aircraft played a key role?
Just have a word.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. It did play a key role. It was a very valuable asset, alongside others, including A400M. I think that's also got a connection with the Honourable Gentleman's constituency. I visited the Honourable Gentleman's constituency. There are great skills there in the defence sector. I was delighted to make that announcement. I'm delighted to see that investment going into that part of our country.
Margaret Farrier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has the Secretary of State for Defence made of the impact of the introduction of operational MGS employment contracts on levels of staff fatigue and security at UK military bases?
Whenever we examine new arrangements for services for our military, we of course examine all the impacts on security, on accountability and indeed performance.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Will the Secretary of State inform the House what members should do when they are contacted by people who have been of assistance to our armed forces in Afghanistan, but whom they have reason to believe the Taliban are hunting? Is there any help that we will be able to give them, and how should we go about approaching the government to secure that help?
Thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. If in the first instance he were to advise them to go to the ARAP website and apply to the scheme, but it does no harm at all, as many colleagues have done, to write to me or my right honourable friend the Secretary of State in parallel, and we're working through those cases at best speed.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, when you have people who are pursuing successful careers in the armed forces, and when sometimes they go back to their old school and say, look, this is what I've done, this is what you can do, this can be a real incentive to recruitment. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that this would be a good way for him to coordinate with the Secretary of State for Education in the future?
So stay.
I do think it's an incredibly important way to inspire young people about the careers that are ahead. I also think when politics don't get in the way of that recruitment, we are much better. I remember being banned from a school in Dundee when I was doing military recruiting, not me personally, because ideologically it didn't fit with some narrative.
Very good. Girl, man,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just following on from the Honourable Gentleman's question about those individuals that were working with British military forces in Afghanistan, for those who have found that they have been refused under the ARAP scheme, what is going to happen to these individuals? Are they then going to be referred to the Home Office or to FCDO, or are they just now been left in limbo?
Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Lady, for her question. They don't automatically get referred to the Afghan Citizen Resettlement Scheme. Instead, Mr. Speaker, they're invited to apply to that. And in letters from the MOD to colleagues in explaining that people have not been eligible for ARAP, we're providing the details for how to apply to the ACRS.
Dave Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, is the Secretary of State able to update the House on the renewal of the red arrows, thank you. Sorry, the red arrows and the renewal of the Hawk aircraft, which are now quite old, whether there's plans to actually renew them in the near future?
There's no plans to renew them. The taking out of service of the Hawk T1's non-red arrows will obviously provide a significant amount of spares and support available for the current Red Arrow fleet going forward. There's no plans in the immediate future or even the medium term to currently review the Red Arrows.
Point of order.
Mr. Speaker, in response to my honourable friend...
Check some. It is relating to the question we just had. Okay.
Earlier, Mr. Speaker, in response to my honourable friend, the member for Kilmarnock and Loudon, the Secretary of State stated that the naval base at both Faslane and Coalport's fire services had been nationalised, yet Capita won the contract last year to provide the fire services for Faslane and Coalport naval bases. Would the Secretary of State like to come to the dispatch box, maybe to rectify that anomaly?
We've got a willing Secretary of State for you.
Mr. Speaker, I think the best way for you to rectify it is to read Hansard. You'll see very clearly in there that I referred to AWE in that place, and I think you'll see it there in black and white.
Yeah. And you know, it's on the record, and what I would say is we aren't going to continue the debate. Right, we're now coming to statements. A business statement. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will make a statement on the UK gas market. As honourable and right honourable members will be aware, over the weekend I held discussions with Ofgem and energy companies, and this morning I held a further roundtable discussion. Today I will set out the government's approach to manage the impact of high global gas prices affecting the UK and countries across Europe. To begin, I want to make 2 points extremely clear. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, I must stress that protecting consumers is our our primary focus, and will shape our entire approach to this important issue. Secondly, I also want to reassure the House that while the UK, like other countries in Europe, has been affected by global prices, Britain benefits from having a diverse range of gas supply sources. We have sufficient capacity, and more than sufficient capacity, to meet demand, and we do not expect supply emergencies to occur this winter. There is absolutely no question, Mr. Speaker, of the lights going out or people being unable to heat their homes. There'll be no 3-day working weeks or a throwback to the 1970s. Such thinking, Mr. Speaker, is alarmist, unhelpful, and completely misguided. To begin, I'd like to set out, Mr. Speaker, some of the context for the global situation we are now witnessing. As the world comes out of COVID-19 and economies reopen, we are seeing a dramatic uptick in global gas demand much faster than many people had anticipated. High demand, Mr. Speaker, in Asia for liquefied natural gas transported globally by freight means that far less LNG has reached Europe. Weather events in the US have also affected LNG exports to Europe. So therefore, increased demand coupled with reduced variety of supply globally has put upward pressure on the price of gas which is traded globally. High wholesale gas prices have subsequently driven an increase in wholesale power prices, with a number of short-term markets trading at or near record levels. While we are not complacent, we do not expect supply emergencies this winter. This is a very important point. This is not a question of security of supply. The GB, the Great British UK gas system, has delivered securely to date and is expected to continue to function effectively with a diverse range of supply sources and sufficient delivery capacity to more than meet the demand. The National Grid Electricity System Operator has the tools within itself to operate the electricity system reliably, to balance that system, and we remain confident that electricity security can be maintained under a very wide range of scenarios. We aren't reliant on any one particular source for our gas, like many of our friends in Europe. Domestic production, as members and right honourable members should know, is our largest single gas supply source and accounted for about 50% of total supply last year. However, the UK also benefits from an excellent relationship with Norway, one of our most important and reliable energy partners, and that delivers nearly 30% of our total gas supply. Just in the last half hour, Mr. Speaker, I was privileged enough to speak to the Norwegian Energy Minister and to welcome the announcement from Equinor today that gas production will significantly increase from the 1st of October this year to support the UK and European demand. Our remaining supply, Mr. Speaker, is sourced from global markets via two interconnectors to the continent and also through the our LNG infrastructure, which is, as many of you know, as many members know, is the largest in Europe. Obviously, the global gas situation has had an impact on some of our energy suppliers. We've already seen 4 suppliers exit the market in recent weeks, and we may well expect to see further companies exiting the market over the coming weeks. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, at this point, that having been Energy Minister for nearly 2 years before I became Secretary of State, we saw in those 2 years, around this time, companies exiting the market. It may well be more this year, but this is something which, at this time of year, ahead of the renewable obligation certificate payment, this is something which is often seen in the market. I want to make it very clear today, however, that this is not unusual. It is not unusual for smaller energy suppliers to exit the market, particularly, I may add, when wholesale global prices are rising. The sector has seen, as I've said, regular entry and exit over the last 5 to 10 years, and that is indeed a feature of a highly competitive market. The current global situation, as I've said, Mr. Speaker, may see more suppliers than usual exiting the market, but this is not something which should be any cause for alarm or panic. We have clear processes in place to make sure that all customers are supplied with energy. When an energy supplier typically fails, Mr. Speaker, Ofgem appoints another supplier to take on serving the customers, and there is no interruption to supply. I reiterate, our first and primary consideration is for the customer. I'd like to stress 3 further principles which are guiding my and the government's approach in this matter. Firstly, the government will not be bailing out failed companies. There will be no rewards for failure or mismanagement. The taxpayer should not be expected to prop up companies which have poor business models and are not resilient to fluctuations in price. Secondly, customers, especially, most particularly, vulnerable customers, must be protected from price spikes. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we must ensure that the energy market does not pay the price for the poor practices of a minority of companies, and that the market still maintains the competition which is a feature of today's current system. We must not simply return to, I quote, the cosy oligopoly of years past, where a few large suppliers simply dictated to customers conditions and pricing. I'd like to reassure all members and honourable members' constituents that the energy price cap, which saves 15 million households up to £100 a year, is staying. It's not going anywhere. As I said earlier, our priority in this situation has to be the consumer, the great British public. And the cap has done that effectively. It protects and has protected millions of customers from sudden increases in global prices this winter. We are committed to that price cap and it will remain in place. Meanwhile, sir, our warm home discount, winter fuel payments and cold weather payments will continue to support millions of vulnerable and low-income households with their energy bills. It is absolutely vital that the energy supply sector remains a liberalised, competitive market in order to deliver value and good service to consumers. As a result of high global gas prices, members and right honourable members will have read, perhaps, that 2 fertiliser plants shut down in Teesside and Cheshire last week. They suspended the production of CO2 and ammonia, a decision which has surely has affected in the short term our domestic supply of carbon dioxide, which, as everybody knows, is used in the food and drink, and as well as the nuclear and health sectors. Yesterday, I met Tony Will, the Global Chief Executive of CF Industries. We discussed the pressures the business is facing, and we have explored quite thoroughly possible ways to secure vital supplies. Work is ongoing across departments in Whitehall, across the government, to ensure that those sectors which are impacted, which are affected by this announcement, have appropriate contingency plans in place to ensure that there is indeed minimal disruption. To maintain our domestic supplies of CO2, we are in constant contact with relevant companies who produce and supply CO2, and we are monitoring the situation minute by minute. Over the past few days, as has been widely reported, I have held several discussions with chief executives of the UK's largest energy suppliers and operators, and also with Ofgem to discuss this vital issue. Just this morning, I chaired a roundtable with UK energy companies and the representatives of consumer groups, in which I reiterated, as I have done on the floor of this House, the need for all of us in government and across the industry to prioritise customers, in short, to protect the consumer. Meetings are continuing across government today and throughout the course of this week. In terms of further actions and statements, Mr. Speaker, this afternoon, shortly after the statement presented here, I will be making a joint statement with Ofgem, setting out the government's next steps following healthy and illuminating, in many cases, discussions with them and suppliers. Mr. Speaker, our security of gas supply is robust, but it is the case that the UK is still too reliant on fossil fuels. Our exposure to volatile global gas prices underscores the importance of our plan to build a strong, homegrown renewable energy sector to strengthen our energy security into the future. Thanks to the steps that we have made as a government, renewable energy sources have quadrupled in terms of gigawattage of capacity since 2010. Far more than quadrupled, in fact. But there is still clearly a lot more we can do in this area. That is why we have committed to approve at least one large-scale new nuclear project in the next few years and are backing the next generation of advanced nuclear technology with £385 million, helping to attract billions of pounds in private capital and create tens of thousands of jobs. Consumers come first, to conclude, Mr. Speaker, and we must protect our constituents.
Before anybody bothers, it is totally unacceptable to spend so long. You've not warned the opposition. The fact that you've taken almost 13 minutes, I would have thought the people that put this together would time this out. It is 10 minutes for a statement. We need to get back into the rules of the House, not the rules that I make, the rules that this House makes. So what I'm going to say to the opposition is, I'm sorry you didn't know it was going to take so long, but by all means you can more than have an extra minute or whatever to try and compensate for this. But please, in future, we do get it right. We shouldn't take advantage of the members here who are here to question the Secretary of State. So, Secretary of State, Edmund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? And can I first of all say that he is right, and I agree with him, that we should not be alarmist on the issue of security of supply. But I do fear his statement was much too complacent on the price and economic impacts of the current situation. First, let me ask him about the continuity of supply issue. We support him taking all necessary measures to ensure that families and businesses continue to have access to energy, and we secure the issue of CO2 supplies. Now, he says, Mr. Speaker, there are mechanisms in place to ensure that customers of failing companies get taken on. But I do say to him that the scale of problems in the market will provide an unprecedented test of those mechanisms. So can he tell us whether he believes taxpayer support will be necessary to deal with the problem? And if it is, obviously we must ensure value for money. I welcome his caution about outcomes which lead to taxpayer subsidy for big companies to further concentrate their market share. But can he therefore explain what the alternatives are and what he proposes happens to the customers of suppliers that do not get through this crisis? He's making a statement later on this afternoon. It'd be good to know what he's going to say. Second, Mr. Speaker, on the impact of price rises on businesses and industry, can he set out his plans to support businesses, particularly energy-intensive industries? Has he considered with his colleagues the provision of government support, including possibly loans, to help businesses facing difficulties? On consumer support, he is right to keep the price cap in place. It's a measure, Mr. Speaker, I have long supported. But the rise in the price cap of £139 means 500,000 more families will be plunged into fuel poverty. Now, at a minimum, he should be looking at making the operation of the £140 Warm Homes discount automatic and possibly extending it. But even that will not be enough, Mr. Speaker. Families are facing a triple whammy: rising energy prices, national insurance rises, and at the end of this month, the £1,000 cut in universal credit. Mr. Speaker, these energy price rises turn the indefensible decision on universal credit into an unconscionable one. If he really wants to put consumers first, if he really wants to help working people, if he really wants to tackle fuel poverty, isn't it time, even at this late stage, to cancel this terrible decision on universal credit? Third, we need to learn longer-term lessons from this crisis about the resilience of our energy system and the lack of resilience which has contributed to very large price spikes. Now, there are global issues on this. He's right about that, but the UK is facing particular difficulties. Let me give him some examples of government decision-making. In 2017, the gas storage facility Rough, then 75% of our storage, was planned for closure. The government could have acted to keep it open, but did nothing. Our lack of gas storage was raised by industry, the GMB union, and by the chair of the Bay Select Committee in 2019, my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West. The Minister said in reply to her, the UK's gas system is secure and well placed to respond effectively to unexpected changes in supply and demand. Mr. Speaker, wasn't the government then as now far too complacent on the issue of gas storage. Next, energy efficiency. Now this could significantly cut the demand for gas, but we've had the fiasco of the Green Deal, followed by the fiasco of the Green Homes Grant, and then the delayed heat and building strategy. And actually, Mr. Speaker, emissions from buildings are today higher than they were in 2015. When is he going to have a proper retrofit plan? On new nuclear, the programme is, you might say, stalled. And while we've made progress on renewables, and he is right about that, the truth is we need to go further and faster with a more diverse supply. Above all, Mr. Speaker, there is just not yet enough of a clear plan from government for how we meet net zero with affordability and security. He will have read the Climate Change Committee's progress report this summer, where they said it is hard to discern any comprehensive strategy. Isn't the truth that there's a direct line from delay, dither and failure to the issues we face today? Now, in the midst of this crisis, can I urge him, therefore, to use this autumn's net zero strategy, delayed, net zero review, delayed, and the comprehensive spending review to finally put in place a proper plan. Households, businesses and energy suppliers are looking to the government for support and direction as we face this crisis. It requires not words, but action and delivery. And, Mr. Speaker, it is long past time for government to get a grip.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to apologise for the lengthy statement that I issued just a few moments ago. I'd like to address a couple of the points that the Right Honourable Gentleman made. He talks about a plan. I mean, we've got plans and strategies galore. We have the Energy White Paper, which was widely received, and I was very happy to present that as Energy Minister. We also have the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. And I was very struck by the fact that when John Kerry, former Secretary of State Kerry, came to the UK, he publicly said that the UK's plans for decarbonisation were more advanced than any other country. In terms of, I think, his very legitimate concern about vulnerable customers, I have made it very clear to industry and also to Ofgem that vulnerable customers are absolutely our #1 priority. We are looking at the warm home discount. We've always, as a government, focused on protecting the vulnerable and people in fuel poverty, and we will continue to do so.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is entirely right. The UK is far better placed than most other European countries when it comes to the sources and diversity of its gas supplies, not least thanks to the 2 major liquefied natural gas terminals in my constituency at Milford Haven. So would you join me in paying tribute to the teams working at the South Hook and Dragon LNG terminals, but also make a commitment today to work with myself, the Port Authority and industry on the Haven there to make that transition to the next stage of our energy development and see a new generation of floating offshore wind and other renewable energy sources there?
My right honourable friend will be well aware there is a commitment to floating offshore wind in the Energy White Paper and the 10-point plan. We've explicitly set a 1 gigawatt target for 2030. I fully expect and hope that that is exceeded. And I'm also very, very pleased to be able to tell him that I'll be very keenly focused on Dragon LNG. I haven't visited it yet in my 2 years as Energy Minister and Secretary of State, but I'd be very happy to accede to his invitation.
SNP spokesperson Stephen Flynn.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State almost brought himself to say it, but decades of underinvestment in renewable technologies, the barriers put in place by Brexit, 11 years of Tory austerity, a national insurance tax hike, the plan to rob £20 per week from those claiming universal credit, food prices rising, shelves emptying, and now this, energy consumers facing skyrocketing, eye-watering bills. Let's call this what it is, Mr. Speaker. This is a cost of living crisis, and it's one created on the watch of this UK government. So what now? What's the plan? Well, I don't, with all due respect, think that the warm words of the Secretary of State quite cut it. He mentioned the energy price cap, but what he failed to acknowledge was the fact that in just a matter of weeks, the energy price cap will be at its highest level ever. So will he therefore back new financial support for those in the lowest income households? And will he, of course, call on the Chancellor to scrap the cut to universal credit? He did acknowledge, of course, that it's not just households who are being hammered by this rise in gas prices, it's also businesses, in particular those who produce and transport goods. He didn't say what specific support he intends to provide to those businesses. On renewables, one of the key solutions to our supply issues lie not in nuclear, of course not in nuclear, but in the Scottish Munros with hydro-pumped storage. So can I ask the Secretary of State, when will he finally introduce a mechanism to make that technology really come to the fore? And just finally, Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me not to ask the Secretary of State at this moment in time, what message would he have for the likes of the Prime Minister, who of course told us in 2016 that if we vote to leave the European Union, then energy bills will be reduced?
So I find it extraordinary that the honourable gentleman is still relitigating the so-called Brexit wars. Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, this is a serious issue, and it's not a time to refight the battles of 5 years ago. In respect of the comments that he made, I am fully conscious of the outstanding contribution that hydroelectric power plays. In fact, I was just speaking to the Norwegian minister, and that country has 96% of its electricity deriving from hydropower. The geography of our own country means that we cannot reach to that level, but that's something which I've absolutely asked officials to look into, and he will know, given my record, both as Energy Minister and as Secretary of State, that I'm a very keen supporter of renewable energy. And as I've always said, and I said to the right honourable gentleman opposite, the safety, the consideration, the focus on protecting vulnerable customers in the case of this government is absolute.
Angela Lentz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is absolutely right to reassure consumers that energy security in the UK is safe. But does he agree with me that we need to urgently move towards far greater, as we transition away from fossil fuels towards renewables, electricity market reform? So what we urgently need is an independent system operator, and we need much more local generation and local energy pricing to encourage consumers to use plentiful wind and solar energy when they are generating for their optional energy use.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend very much, and of course remind the House that when I was appointed as Energy Minister, she in fact was the Secretary of State in the department and really pushed a great deal of reform and innovation in this area. I'd like to reassure her that conversations about an independent system operator and how we can actually modernise the way we balance the electricity system are happening all the time, and I'd be very open to hearing her suggestions about how we can bring that about. I think that energy security in this country, thanks in part to her efforts when she held the post I currently do, are good. We have a diversity of supply. We've considered a wide range of renewables, and in fact we are pioneering and leading the world in the development of renewable technology.
Darren Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for advance copy of his statement. There are, of course, a whole range of important questions here to be answered to ensure that we don't face similar energy crises in the future. And my committee will be asking ministers to answer those questions over the coming days and weeks. But can I ask the Secretary of State a specific question today? Can he guarantee that the Warm Homes Discount rebate will continue to be paid to consumers who are forced to change energy supplier?
Secretary of State.
I know he is tempting me on dangerous ground, but of course any guarantee of that kind has a fiscal implication, which he will no doubt be aware is also a matter for Treasury as well. So we're in constant discussion about that. I look forward to seeing him in his usual place in the committee on Wednesday. I know that he takes these matters very seriously, and I'm sure we will have fuller discussion of these subjects then.
Sir John Bradford.
Will the Secretary of State talk to the industry urgently about having more gas storage capacity? We have tiny capacity compared with most advanced countries, and it would provide a buffer to smooth supplies and keep prices down if this turns out, as we hope it will be, to be a short-term interruption to supply from Russia and America?
I think the right honourable gentleman, with his characteristic acuity, hits the nail on the head. Gas storage is definitely an issue, but actually the fact that he pointed out is that we don't know how long this spike in the gas price lasts. We mustn't precipitate a rush or through any alarmism instigate panic. There's no cause for that at all. But clearly this is a situation that needs to be reviewed. I'm very happy to speak to him about particular solutions. I know he's got various views on interconnectors, and I look forward to discussing with him very frankly about the way ahead.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to that question, the Honourable Gentleman referred to our tiny capacity. The UK cut its strategic gas storage to 1.7% of annual demand, when a former government advisor suggested it should be closer to 25%. In light of this, why did the government allow for the Rough storage facility off the Yorkshire coast to close without taking action?
As I've said repeatedly from this dispatch box today, we do have a wide source of energy supply. We have by far the largest offshore wind capacity in the world. There's no reason why we should be inducing panic because of the closure of gas storage facilities. It's something that I said we should look at, but I don't think it's right for honourable members and right honourable members to stoke alarm simply by focusing on questions that aren't really relevant to today's debate.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I declare interest as the Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on energy security. Can I pay tribute to the Secretary of State for the action he's taken to protect consumers and to calm the concerns that some commentators and some members here have expressed? But does my right honourable friend agree that diversity is the key phrase to reduce the long-term risk of such volatility in the markets? That's diversity of supply, diversity in energy generation, be that wind, nuclear, biomass, hydro or other sources, but also diversity in location, in that some where the energy is generated. Some nations, regions and even countries have an excess supply on some occasions and a shortfall on others. The greater the diversity, the less the risk. And is he sufficiently reassured that Ofgem are sufficiently proactive in this field?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. He spoke about three distinct categories, and I can assure him that on all three we have a degree of robustness. In terms of the spread of the gas supply, I've said that we have a wide range of sources for gas. In terms of electricity generation, I can reassure him that our work with renewables, we brought onshore wind, offshore wind, solar. There's a much wider range of energy supply, electricity generation supply in the UK than in practically any other country. And in terms of geographical spread, he will notice that a lot of these installations, a lot of this capacity is spread very evenly across the United Kingdom. And I happen to know that because I spent a large part of the last 2 years visiting those sites.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. CF Fertilisers, based in my constituency, is one of the plants that has had to close down in light of these